The cold autumn rain pounded against the cracked pavement, creating rivers of murky water that flowed along the gutters of the abandoned industrial district. Among the shadows of decaying buildings, a woman walked alone, her umbrella fighting. Against the wind, her footsteps hurried yet hesitant. She was about to make a decision that would not only save a life, but transform her own in ways she could never imagine. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Rain struck the ground in sheets, drowning out most sounds. As Sarah Bennett hurried along the narrow path between the abandoned warehouses. She was taking a shortcut home from her late shift at the veterinary clinic, a route she normally avoided. The old industrial park had been vacant for years, its hollow buildings now home to squatters and stray animals. The city council had plans to demolish it all next month to make way for luxury apartments. Another gentrification project that would erase both history and habitats in one swift bulldozer pass. Sarah pulled her coat tighter as the wind picked up, sending a cascade of raindrops from her umbrella down her back. Her scrubs were already damp beneath her raincoat, and her feet ached from standing for 12 hours straight. All she wanted was a hot shower and her bed, but something made her pause. A sound barely audible above the drumming rain. A whimper, soft and pained, coming from the shadow of a collapsed loading dock. She should have kept walking. That's what Dr. Harmon, the senior veterinarian, always preached at the clinic. You can't save them all, Bennett. That's the first lesson in this business. He'd seen too many young vets burn out, trying to rescue every stray, heal every broken creature. The city pound exists for a reason, he'd remind her whenever she stayed late to treat animals the clinic couldn't officially take in. But Sarah had never been good at ignoring suffering. With a deep sigh that clouded in the cold air, she directed her phone's flashlight toward the sound. At first, she saw nothing but broken concrete and twisted metal. Then, a slight movement caught her eye, the faintest shift of shadows against shadows. "Hello?" she called out, immediately feeling foolish. Whatever was there wasn't going to answer her. Taking cautious steps forward, Sarah moved closer, keeping the beam of light steady. That's when she saw it. A dog, or what was left of one, huddled against the crumbling wall. It was so thin that its skeleton pressed visibly against its matted fur, which might once have been golden but was now a filthy grey-brown. One ear stood partially upright, the other hung in tatters. Its eyes, when they reflected her light, showed neither fear nor hope, just a dull acceptance of its fate. Sarah's throat tightened. In her 3 years at the clinic, she'd seen animals in terrible conditions, but something about this dog's resigned posture broke her heart in a new way. It wasn't even trying to move away from her approach, as if it had already accepted that death was coming and no longer cared from which direction. "Hey there," she whispered, crouching down several feet away, making herself smaller, less threatening. "It's okay." The dog raised its head slightly, requiring visible effort. As it did, Sarah could see the extent of its condition. Patches of skin exposed where fur had fallen out, open sores along its emaciated flanks, and worst of all, a deep, infected wound around its neck, where a collar had clearly been embedded and then either removed roughly or broken off. The rain had washed away some of the blood, but the wound was angry and red. Speaking of prolonged suffering, this wasn't just a stray. This was an abandoned pet, one that someone had tied up and left, perhaps right here in this industrial wasteland, too Die slowly of starvation, exposure, or whatever predators might find it first. Anger flared inside Sarah, momentarily warming her against the chill. People could be so unbelievably cruel. She'd seen it too many times, pets discarded like broken toys when they became inconvenient, expensive, or simply boring to their owners. The dog made another small sound, more exhale than whimper this time. Sarah knew she had limited options. The clinic was closed. The emergency animal hospital across town would take the dog, but they'd charge fees up front, fees that would come out of Sarah's already stretched paycheck. The city shelter was overcrowded and underfunded. A dog in this condition would likely be euthanized immediately. "I'm not leaving you here," she decided aloud. Moving slowly, she shrugged off her raincoat despite the persistent downpour and carefully approached. The dog watched her, but made no attempt to escape or even growl, a bad sign. Any healthy dog, even a friendly one, would show some wariness toward a stranger. "I'm going to help you," Sarah said softly, extending her hand, palm down, for the dog to sniff. "I promise I won't hurt you." The dog's nostrils flared slightly, taking in her scent, but otherwise it remained still. Up close, Sarah could see that its eyes were clouded, possibly from malnutrition or infection. It was a male dog, older than she'd initially thought, maybe 5 or 6 years, judging by the grey around his muzzle, though the hardship he'd endured might have prematurely aged him. With gentle movements, Sarah draped her coat over the dog, creating a barrier between his skin and her hands. Even through the fabric, she could feel every rib, the sharp protrusion of hip bones, the irregular beat of his heart. He weighed almost nothing as she carefully lifted him. Another terrible sign. A dog of his frame, which suggested he might be a golden retriever mix, should weigh at least 70 pounds. This poor creature couldn't be more than 40. "You're coming home with me tonight," she told him as she cradled him against her chest, trying to shield him from the rain with what remained of her umbrella. "Tomorrow we'll figure out next steps." The dog didn't struggle as she carried him, navigating carefully through the industrial debris and back toward the street. If anything, he seemed to relax slightly, his head coming to rest against her shoulder. Not trust yet, but perhaps the faintest recognition that something had changed. Sarah's apartment was a 15-minute walk from where she'd found him. By the time she reached her building, she was soaked through, her scrubs clinging uncomfortably to her skin, her hair plastered to her face. The dog had remained motionless, in her arms, his breathing shallow but steady. Her neighbor Mrs. Patel was in the lobby collecting her mail. The elderly woman's eyes widened at the sight of Sarah drenched and carrying what looked more like a bundle of dirty rags than a living animal. "Sarah, what on earth?" "Found him abandoned," Sarah explained quickly, heading for the stairs. "Just for tonight, until I can get him proper help." Mrs. Patel peered more closely, her face softening when she realized what Sarah was carrying. "Poor thing. Do you need anything? I have some leftover chicken soup." "That would be amazing." "Actually," Sarah said gratefully, "maybe some warm broth if you can separate it. He probably can't handle solids yet." "I'll bring it up in 10 minutes, Mrs. Patel promised, already heading back to her ground-floor apartment. Sarah's own apartment on the 3rd floor was small, but meticulously clean, a necessity when you regularly brought home the scents of the veterinary clinic. She carried the dog directly to the bathroom, where she could contain any mess and keep him warm. Setting him gently on the bath mat, she quickly gathered supplies. Clean towels, a digital thermometer, the first aid kit she kept well stocked. a bowl of lukewarm water, and the bottle of diluted iodine solution she used for her own occasional cuts and scrapes. The dog watched her movements with those clouded eyes, still making no attempt to move. Now, in the harsh bathroom light, his condition looked even worse. Where his fur had fallen out, his skin showed signs of fungal infection. The wound around his neck oozed clear fluid mixed with blood. His paws were raw, the pads cracked and bleeding in places, evidence of how far he must have walked before. Collapsing at the warehouse, preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Okay," Sarah said, as much to herself as to the dog. First. Things first. She took his temperature, 101, 3 degrees, slightly elevated but not dangerously so. She checked his gums, pale and dry, indicating dehydration. His pulse was rapid and weak. These were all concerning signs, but not immediately life-threatening. This dog had been dying slowly for weeks, perhaps months. With gentle hands, she began cleaning him, using warm water and a soft cloth to remove the worst of the dirt and assess his injuries. The dog flinched occasionally but made no sound, watching her with that same unsettling resignation. "You must have been someone's pet once," Sarah murmured as she worked, noticing the places where his fur beneath the grime showed signs of once having been groomed. "What happened to you? Did they just throw you away when you got sick?" As if understanding her words, the dog closed his eyes, a tremor running through his thin body. A soft knock at the door interrupted her work. Mrs. Patel had brought not only a container of clear, warm chicken broth, but also a clean, old blanket for him to rest on, she explained, handing the items to Sarah. "I raised 4 children and nursed more sick puppies than I can count back in Mumbai. This one has been through something terrible, yes?" Sarah nodded, grateful for the woman's matter-of-fact kindness. "Someone abandoned him, left him to die." Mrs. Patel clicked her tongue in disapproval. "Some people do not deserve the love animals give, but he is lucky he found you." After her neighbor left, Sarah returned to the bathroom, where the dog hadn't moved an inch. She set a shallow dish of the warm broth near his muzzle. The scent roused him slightly. His nostrils flared, and his tongue made a weak attempt to lick his chapped lips. "That's it," Sarah encouraged, dipping her fingers in the broth and bringing them to his mouth. "Just a little to start." It took several attempts, but eventually the dog began to lap weakly at the liquid. Sarah allowed him only small amounts, knowing that too much too quickly could make him sick. When he'd had enough, just a few tablespoons. But it was a start. She turned her attention to his wounds. The neck injury was her greatest concern. The flesh was inflamed with clear signs of infection. Whatever had been around his neck, a collar, a rope, a chain, had been there for a very long time, gradually cutting into his skin as he lost weight or grew, or perhaps as he struggled to free himself. Sarah cleaned the wound as gently as possible, applying antibiotic ointment from her kit. The dog whimpered once, the first real sound she'd heard from him, when she touched a particularly sensitive area. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I know it hurts. I'm trying to help." When she had done all she could, Sarah laid the blanket Mrs. Patel had brought on the bathroom floor, creating a soft bed away from the cold tiles. With careful movements, she transferred the dog onto it, He curled into himself immediately, his thin body forming a tight ball of self-protection. Sarah sat on the edge of the bathtub, suddenly aware of how exhausted she was. Her clothes were still damp, her muscles ached, and emotionally she felt wrung out. This dog's condition wasn't something that had happened overnight. It represented weeks, maybe months of suffering that would have been entirely preventable if whoever owned him had simply surrendered him to a shelter instead of abandoning him to a slow, painful death. Her phone showed it was past midnight. She had to be back at the clinic by 9 the next morning. What she should do was get some sleep and then take the dog to the clinic with her, where at least they had proper equipment and medications. But looking at him now, curled up and trembling slightly despite the blanket and the warmth of the room, Sarah couldn't bear to leave him alone. Not when he'd been alone for so long already. She quickly changed into dry clothes, then grabbed her pillow and comforter from her bed. Returning to the bathroom, she made herself a makeshift bed on the floor next to the dog. It wasn't comfortable, but it would do for one night. "I'm staying right here," she told him, settling down beside his blanket. "You're not alone anymore." The dog opened his eyes briefly, that same dull gaze meeting hers. There was no gratitude there, no sudden connection like in the movies. Just a creature too beaten down by life to expect anything good to last. It broke Sarah's heart all over. Again. "It's okay if you don't believe me yet," she said softly. "I'll prove it to you." Sleep came fitfully for Sarah, interrupted by the need to check on the dog throughout the night. Each time she woke, she found him in exactly the same position, eyes closed but body tense, as if resting but not truly sleeping. She offered him water and more broth at intervals, which he accepted with increasing, if still minimal, interest. By the time her alarm went off at 7, Sarah had managed perhaps 3 hours of broken sleep. Her back ached from the hard floor, and her eyes felt gritty, but the dog was still alive, his breathing a little stronger than the night before. "Good morning," she said, meeting his gaze as his eyes fluttered open. "How are you feeling today?" The dog made no response, but he did follow her movement with his eyes as she stood and stretched, a small improvement over the vacant stare of the previous night. Sarah quickly showered and dressed for work, then prepared a more substantial offering for the dog, a mixture of soft-boiled rice, more chicken broth from Mrs. Patel, and a tiny amount of canned pumpkin from her own cupboard. Gentle foods that wouldn't shock his system. To her relief, he ate with slightly more enthusiasm than before, though still slowly and cautiously, as if expecting the food to be taken away at any moment. "I have to go to work," she told him as she cleaned up. "But I'm taking you with me. Dr. Harmon might not like it, but he owes me about 100 hours of overtime, so he can deal with it." The challenge was transportation. Sarah usually walked or took the bus to the clinic, neither of which was suitable for moving a sick dog. After a moment's consideration, she called a rideshare, explaining to the driver in her request that she had an injured animal with her. The driver who arrived, a middle-aged man named Raj, was thankfully understanding. "My sister is a vet tech," he explained as he helped Sarah carry the blanket-wrapped dog to the car. "I know how it is. You people never stop working, even when you're off the clock." At the clinic, Sarah braced herself for Dr. Harmon's disapproval, but to her surprise, the older veterinarian took one look at the dog and immediately cleared an examination room. "Damn people," he muttered as he helped Sarah transfer the dog to the table. "I swear they get worse every year." Together, they conducted a more thorough examination than Sarah had been able to do in her bathroom. The dog's condition was serious, severe malnutrition, dehydration, infected wounds, heartworm, and a respiratory infection that explained the congestion Sarah had noticed in his breathing. "He's been out there a long time," Dr. Harmon said grimly, examining the neck wound. "This collar was probably put on him as a puppy and never changed as he grew. See how it's embedded in layers? That's years of growth around a fixed restraint." Sarah felt sick at the thought. "Can we help him?" Dr. Harmon was silent for a long moment, his experienced hands gently probing the dog's abdomen, checking for internal issues. "It won't be easy," he finally said. "He's severely compromised. The malnutrition alone would be challenging, but with the infections and heartworm on top of it—" He paused, meeting Sarah's eyes. "The shelter would euthanize immediately. Even some private practices would recommend it as the humane option." Sarah held her breath, knowing that Dr. Harmon's opinion carried weight. Despite his gruff exterior, he was an excellent veterinarian with decades of experience, if he thought the dog couldn't be saved. "But," he continued, surprising her, "I've seen worse cases pull through. Not many, but some." He straightened. "Up, decision made. Let's start him on IV fluids and antibiotics. The heartworm treatment will have to wait until he's stronger, and that neck wound needs proper cleaning and debridement under sedation." Relief flooded through Sarah. "So we're treating him? The clinic is taking him on?" Dr. Harmon gave her a sharp look. "The clinic isn't taking on anything. You are. I'm helping because I can't in good conscience turn away an animal in this condition. But Sarah, be clear about this. He's your responsibility. The treatments, the aftercare, the decisions about his future, all yours." It was fair, Sarah knew. The clinic operated on tight margins. Taking on pro bono cases was a luxury they couldn't often afford. That Dr. Harmon was willing to help. Et al. Was more than she'd expected. "I understand," she said firmly. "Thank you." Dr. Harmon nodded, then surprised her again by adding, "For what it's worth, I think you're making the right call. There's still life in those eyes. Faint, but it's there." Sarah looked down at the dog, who was watching the exchange between the humans with that same quiet, resigned gaze. Dr. Harmon was right. There was life there, buried beneath layers of suffering and betrayal, but not yet extinguished. "He needs a name," she realized aloud. "I can't keep calling him the dog." Dr. Harmon shrugged. "Your rescue, your naming rights." Sarah studied the thin creature on the examination table. Despite everything he'd endured, there was a certain dignity in the way he held himself, a quiet endurance that spoke of inner strength. "Phoenix," she decided, "because he's going to rise from these ashes." Dr. Harmon rolled his eyes at the sentiment, but Sarah caught the faint smile he tried to hide. "All right then, Phoenix it is. Let's get him started on treatment." The next few days were some of the most challenging of Sarah's professional life. She essentially worked double shifts, her regular clinic hours followed by the special care Phoenix required. Dr. Harmon had allowed her to set up a recovery space in the clinic's back room, where Phoenix could stay under observation without taking up an examination room. The first 72 hours were critical. Phoenix received round-the-clock IV fluids to address his severe dehydration, broad-spectrum antibiotics for his multiple infections, and carefully calibrated pain management for his wounds, particularly his neck, which had required minor surgery, to clean and repair properly. Sarah slept on a cot beside his kennel, waking every few hours to check his vitals and adjust his medications. During the day, between her regular patients, she would stop by to offer gentle words of encouragement, and small amounts of the special recovery diet Dr. Harmon had formulated. Phoenix's progress was painfully slow. There were moments when Sarah feared they would lose him, nights when his breathing became so labored that she stayed awake counting each inhale and exhale, days when he refused even the smallest amount of food, setbacks when his fever spiked alarmingly. But gradually, almost imperceptibly, he began to improve. The cloudiness in his eyes cleared somewhat. The wounds started to heal. His body remained skeletal, but the IV nutrition prevented further weight loss. What didn't change was his spirit. Phoenix remained detached, responding to medical care with passive acceptance rather than any sign of fight or personality. He didn't wag his tail when Sarah approached, didn't seek affection or attention, didn't show interest in his surroundings. It was as if the dog inside had retreated so far away that only the physical shell remained. "Give him time," Dr. Harmon advised when Sarah expressed her concern about Phoenix's mental state. Animals who've been through trauma like this, they shut down. It's a survival mechanism. His body is fighting to heal, and his mind has gone somewhere safe until that happens. "Will he come back?" Sarah asked. "The real him, I mean." Dr. Harmon's expression softened slightly. "That depends on a lot of factors. What he was like before, what exactly happened to him, how long he was suffering. And now it depends on you. Consistent care, patience, safety. Those are the only things that might bring him back." It wasn't the definitive reassurance Sarah had hoped for, but it was honest. And somehow that made her even more determined. After 2 weeks of intensive care at the clinic, Phoenix was stable enough to be discharged. Not healed, not healthy, but no longer in immediate danger. He could continue his recovery in a home environment with regular checkups to monitor his progress. The problem was, Sarah's apartment building had a strict no-pets policy. She had managed to keep Phoenix there for that first night only because of the emergency circumstances and Mrs. Patel's discretion. A long-term arrangement was impossible. "I don't know what to do," Sarah admitted to Dr. Harmon as they prepared Phoenix for transport. "I can't bring him back to my place, but he's nowhere near ready for adoption, even if we could find someone willing to take on his medical needs." Dr. Harmon regarded her thoughtfully. "My daughter Lisa has that cottage on her property, the one she used to rent out before the pandemic. It's been sitting empty since her last tenant moved out. Basic but functional, and it's got a fenced yard. She's been meaning to find another renter." Sarah stared at him, hardly daring to hope. "Are you suggesting—" "I'm suggesting it might be a win-win," Dr. Harmon said with a slight shrug. "Lisa gets some income, you get a pet-friendly place, and Phoenix gets the consistent care he needs. Think about it." Sarah didn't need to think. By the end of the day, she had spoken with Lisa, viewed the cottage, a small, somewhat outdated but perfectly habitable one-bedroom structure behind Lisa's main house, and signed a 6-month lease. The rent was reasonable. The location was actually closer to the clinic than her apartment had been, and most importantly, Phoenix would have a safe, quiet place to heal. Moving was a whirlwind affair. Sarah had few possessions and no furniture too large to fit in Lisa's pickup truck. Within 2 days, she had terminated her apartment lease, thankfully on a month-to-month arrangement, packed her belongings, and set up the cottage with the basics she and Phoenix would need. When she finally brought Phoenix home, their home now, the dog showed no reaction to the new environment. He simply followed her inside with slow, careful steps. He was walking on his own now, though weakly. Found the bed she had prepared for him in the living-room corner, and settled onto it with the same quiet resignation he had shown from the beginning. "This is your home now," Sarah told him, sitting on the floor beside his bed, "for as long as you need it to be. No one is going to hurt you here. No one is going to abandon you again." Phoenix watched her with those still, distant eyes, then lowered his head onto his paws and closed them, neither accepting nor rejecting her promise. That night, as Sarah lay in her new bedroom listening to the unfamiliar creaks of the cottage, she found herself questioning her decisions. Had she taken on too much? Phoenix's medical care alone would stretch her finances thin, and now she had moved, changed her entire living situation, for a dog who might never recover emotionally from his trauma. A dog who might never show her affection or gratitude, who might remain forever locked in that state of detached resignation. "It doesn't matter," she told herself firmly in the darkness. "He deserves a chance, whether he ever wags his tail for me or not." With that thought, she finally drifted off to sleep, unaware that in the living room, Phoenix's eyes had opened, and for the first time he was quietly taking in his surroundings, mapping the exits, the windows, the sounds and scents of this new place. This place where, against all his hard-learned expectations, no pain had yet come to him. The days turned into weeks as Sarah established a new routine in the cottage with Phoenix. Every morning began the same way: medication hidden in small portions of soft food, gentle cleaning of his still healing wounds, and quiet encouragement. As she coaxed him to take a few steps around the cottage's small yard, the physical healing was a slow, painstaking process, but it was happening. His fur, though still patchy, was beginning to grow back in places. The terrible neck wound was gradually closing. He was gaining weight, ounce by precious ounce, but emotionally Phoenix remained unreachable. "It's like he's not really here," Sarah confided to Lisa one evening as they sat on the cottage's small porch, watching Phoenix lie motionless on his bed in the yard. He had progressed to spending short periods outdoors, though he never moved, far from the door, and showed no interest in exploring. His body is healing, but the rest of him, it's like he's still tied to that tree, waiting to die. Lisa, a kind-faced woman in her 40s who had inherited her father's practical nature, but not his gruffness, studied the dog thoughtfully. Trauma does that. It freezes people and animals in the moment of their worst pain. My friend works with veterans. She says sometimes they're physically home for years before they're really back. "So what do I do?" Sarah asked, frustration creeping into her voice. "I've tried everything: special treats, toys, talking to him constantly, giving him space, sitting with him in silence. Nothing breaks through." "You keep doing exactly what you're doing," Lisa said firmly. "Safety and consistency. The breakthrough will come when he's ready, not when you are." Sarah nodded, but inwardly doubt gnawed at her. It had been nearly a month since she'd rescued Phoenix. The financial strain was mounting. His medications, special diet, and regular tests at the clinic were expensive, even with Dr. Harmon's generous discounting of his services. Sarah had picked up extra shifts to cover the costs, which meant less time at the cottage with Phoenix, which in turn made her feel guilty for leaving him alone. And what if Lisa was wrong? What if Phoenix never came back from whatever dark place his mind had retreated to? What if he lived out whatever time he had left in this state of hollow existence, never experiencing joy or connection again? The question haunted Sarah as she watched him lie there, physically present but spiritually absent. Phoenix's breakthrough didn't come in a dramatic moment. It wasn't accompanied by swelling music or sudden transformation. It arrived so subtly that Sarah almost missed it. It was a Tuesday evening, 5 weeks after the rescue. Sarah had returned from a grueling double shift at the clinic, bone-tired and emotionally drained after losing an elderly patient despite hours of intervention. She'd barely had the energy to administer Phoenix's medications and prepare his dinner, before collapsing onto the sofa, not even bothering to change out of her scrubs. She must have fallen asleep because she woke with a start to a changed quality of light in the room. The sun had set, and the cottage was bathed in the dim blue glow of evening. For a moment she was disoriented, unsure what had awakened her. Then she felt it, the lightest pressure against her hand, which hung over the edge of the sofa, something warm and slightly damp. Sarah held her breath, not daring to move. Slowly, she turned her head. Phoenix stood beside the sofa, his nose gently touching her fingers. He wasn't looking at her. His gaze was fixed somewhere in the middle distance. But he was there, voluntarily making contact for the first time. Sarah's heart thundered in her chest. She remained completely still, afraid that any movement might shatter this fragile moment. Phoenix's nose moved slightly against her fingers, inhaling her scent. Then, as silently as he had approached, he withdrew, returning to his bed in the corner. It wasn't much, just the briefest acknowledgement of her presence, perhaps even just curiosity about the salty tear tracks on her hand, from her earlier grief over the lost patient. But it was something, a tiny crack in the wall Phoenix had built around himself. The next morning, Sarah called in to take a rare day off. "Personal matters," she told Dr. Harmon, who didn't press for details. She spent the day quietly moving around the cottage, engaging in normal activities, reading, preparing food, doing laundry, while deliberately creating opportunities for Phoenix to approach if he chose to. She sat on the floor near his bed while reading. She prepared his meals in the kitchen with the door open so he could see the process. She spoke to him occasionally in a calm, conversational tone, not expecting responses, but letting him grow accustomed to her voice. Phoenix watched. That was the subtle change. He was actually watching now, tracking her movements with his eyes rather than staring blankly at nothing. When she approached with his food, his ears moved forward slightly, a normal canine gesture of interest that had been absent before. That evening, as Sarah sat on the porch step with a cup of tea, Phoenix surprised her by slowly, cautiously exiting the cottage and settling on the ground a few feet away. Not beside her, not seeking contact, but choosing to be in her vicinity, rather than alone inside. Sarah pretended not to notice, but her heart soared. 2 voluntary approaches in 2 days, after weeks of nothing. Progress continued at this glacial pace. A week later, Phoenix began to show interest in his surroundings, sniffing the perimeter of the yard during their morning walks, rather than simply standing in place until Sarah led him back inside. He started to exhibit preferences, turning away from certain foods, showing slight enthusiasm for others. He would occasionally watch the birds that visited the yard's single oak tree, his head lifting, nostrils flaring with ancient canine interest. But there were setbacks, too. A door slammed by the wind sent him cowering under Sarah's bed for hours. The sound of a truck backfiring left him trembling and withdrawn for an entire day. A tall, broad-shouldered delivery man who came to the door caused him to revert to his completely dissociated state, eyes glazed and body rigid, until the man was long gone. He was abused by a man, Sarah realized aloud after that incident, the pieces falling into place. The dog's reactions, his specific triggers, they painted a picture of not just neglect, but active cruelty, likely at the hands of a male owner. The realization reinforced her commitment. Phoenix hadn't just been abandoned. He had escaped or been discarded by someone who had deliberately hurt him, perhaps for years. His emotional withdrawal wasn't just a response to the trauma of near death. In that industrial lot, it was a coping mechanism developed over a much longer period. At the 2-month mark, Sarah brought Phoenix to the clinic for a comprehensive checkup. Dr. Harmon, who had been monitoring his physical recovery during regular visits, was impressed by the dog's progress. "He's gained 12 pounds, he noted, reviewing the scale reading, still underweight but moving in the right direction, and his blood work shows the infection is finally clearing. I think we can start the heartworm treatment now." The heartworm treatment would be another challenge. A series of painful injections followed by strict activity restrictions to prevent complications. Sarah had been dreading it, knowing the treatment would be another trauma for Phoenix to endure, another potential setback to his fragile emotional progress. But there was no choice. Heartworm was fatal if left untreated. "We'll get through it together," she promised Phoenix as they drove home from the clinic. He sat in the back seat, secured with a special harness, watching the passing scenery with what Sarah now recognized as his version of mild interest. "I know it will be hard, but it's necessary." The first injection was administered the following week. Phoenix bore it stoically, the only sign of his distress a slight stiffening of his body when the needle entered his muscle. The aftermath was harder. Pain at the injection site, fatigue and discomfort as the medication began to kill the worms living in his heart and pulmonary arteries. Sarah created a cocoon of comfort for him. His bed moved to a quiet corner, soft music playing to mask any startling outdoor noises, gentle massages to ease his muscle aches. For 2 days, he barely moved, his eyes once again taking on that vacant look that Sarah had come to dread. On the 3rd day, she awoke to find him standing by her bed, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite interpret. Not quite connection, not quite trust, but expectation. He was hungry, he was in discomfort, and for the first time he was actively seeking her help. "Good morning," she said softly, extending her hand slowly. Phoenix didn't move toward it, but he didn't retreat either. "Ready for some breakfast?" It became their new pattern. Each heartworm injection would be followed by days of discomfort, during which Phoenix would retreat into himself. Then, gradually, he would re-emerge, each time seeming to retain more of his slowly developing personality rather than reverting completely to the shut-down state she'd first found him in. 3 months after the rescue, during a rare weekend when Sarah had both days off, Lisa invited them to join her family for an outdoor barbecue. Sarah was hesitant. Phoenix had never been around children or multiple strangers, but Lisa insisted. "Bring him just for an hour," she suggested. "Ryan has been asking about him non-stop since I mentioned the mystery dog in the back cottage, and it would be good for Phoenix to have some controlled socialization." Ryan was Lisa's 7-year-old son, a gentle, thoughtful child who shared his mother's and grandfather's affinity for animals. Sarah agreed, with the caveat that she would remove Phoenix at the first sign of stress. The barbecue was a small affair, just Lisa, her husband Mike, Ryan, and Lisa's teenage daughter Emma, who was more interested in her phone than the gathering. They set up in the main house's large backyard, careful to keep the grill far from where Phoenix would be. Sarah brought Phoenix over on his leash, which he had only recently learned to walk properly on. She had prepped him as best she could, spending extra time on his morning grooming so he would look less alarming to a child. Though still thin, his coat was growing in nicely now, revealing the golden retriever lineage Sarah had suspected. The bare patches were filling in, and the terrible neck wound had healed into a ring of scar tissue, partially hidden by his fur. "Remember, Ryan, approach slowly and let the dog come to you," Lisa was instructing her son as Sarah and Phoenix entered the yard. "No sudden movements or loud noises." Ryan nodded solemnly, his eyes wide with excitement, but his body language carefully controlled. He sat cross-legged on a picnic blanket, deliberately making himself smaller and less threatening. Sarah led Phoenix to a shady spot about 10 feet from the blanket and sat down on the grass beside him. Phoenix remained standing, his body tense, eyes darting between the unfamiliar humans. "This is Phoenix," Sarah introduced him. "He's still learning how to be around people, so we need to give him lots of space and time." Ryan nodded again, watching the dog with undisguised fascination, but respecting the boundaries Sarah had set. "He's had a hard life, hasn't he?" the boy asked perceptively. "Yes," Sarah answered simply, "but it's getting better now." The adults chatted while Ryan continued his patient observation of Phoenix. After about 20 minutes, Phoenix surprised Sarah by lying down on the grass, still alert but no longer poised for immediate flight. It was a small sign of relaxation, but significant in this new environment. 15 minutes later, Ryan asked, quietly, "Can I offer him a treat? Mom said I should ask you first." Sarah considered it. Phoenix had been doing well with the gentle introduction, showing no signs of fear or aggression. "Sure," she decided, "but stay where you are. I'll bring him a bit closer if he's willing." She took a dog treat from her pocket, one of the soft ones Phoenix particularly enjoyed, and held it out to Ryan. The boy accepted it carefully, then held it flat on his palm, as Sarah had demonstrated. "Phoenix, come," Sarah called softly, a command they had been practicing. Phoenix looked at her, then at Ryan, clearly conflicted. After a moment's hesitation, he stood and followed Sarah the few steps closer to the blanket, stopping at a distance. He deemed safe. "It's okay," Sarah encouraged. "Ryan has something for you." Ryan remained perfectly still, arm extended, the treat balanced on his small palm. Phoenix took one slow step forward, then another, his nostrils flaring as he caught the scent of the treat. With exquisite caution, he stretched his neck to delicately take the morsel from Ryan's hand, his lips carefully avoiding contact with the boy's skin. Ryan's face lit up with a smile so pure it brought tears to Sarah's eyes. "He took it," the boy whispered in awe. "He trusted me." Phoenix retreated immediately to Sarah's side, but the interaction had been successful. No fear, no negative reaction, just a careful navigation of a social exchange. The rest of the visit continued smoothly. Phoenix gradually relaxed enough to lie down again, even accepting a gentle scratch behind the ears from Lisa when she slowly approached. Mike, sensing the dog's wariness of men, kept his distance, which Sarah appreciated. By the time they left an hour later, Phoenix seemed tired, but not stressed. a huge victory for his first social outing. "He did great," Lisa told Sarah as they were leaving. "Honestly, better than I expected." "Me too," Sarah admitted. "Ryan wants to know if he can read to Phoenix sometime," Lisa added with a smile. "He has this program at school where kids read to shelter dogs to help socialize them. He thinks Phoenix might enjoy it." The idea touched Sarah deeply. "I think Phoenix would like that very much." The reading sessions began the following week. Ryan would come to the cottage for half an hour after school, bringing a selection of children's books. He would sit on one end of the sofa while Phoenix occupied his bed nearby and simply read aloud in his clear, expressive voice. At first, Phoenix merely tolerated the boy's presence, watching him warily, but as the sessions continued, something remarkable happened. Phoenix began to anticipate Ryan's visits, standing by the window around the time the boy usually arrived. During the reading, he gradually moved his bed closer to the sofa, until eventually he was lying right beside Ryan's feet as the child read. 4 months after the rescue, Phoenix did something Sarah had begun to believe she might never see. He wagged his tail. It was a brief, tentative movement, just a slight swish in response to Sarah entering the room with his dinner, but it was unmistakable. That small gesture of positive emotion, of anticipation rather than dread, felt like a miracle. The tail wagging increased in frequency over the following weeks, appearing in more contexts. When Sarah picked up his leash for a walk, when Ryan arrived for reading time, when Lisa brought over homemade dog treats. With this emotional thawing came other changes. Phoenix began to show curiosity, investigating new objects in the cottage, following scent trails in the yard. He started to play, cautiously at first, just pushing a tennis ball with his nose, but eventually engaging in brief sessions of fetch, his movements becoming more fluid and dog-like. He was emerging, piece by piece, from the shell of trauma. The transformation wasn't linear. There were still difficult days, still triggers that would send him retreating into himself. But those episodes became shorter, less frequent, and he recovered from them more quickly each time. 5 months after the rescue, Sarah faced a decision. Her lease on the cottage was coming due, and her original plan had been to find Phoenix a permanent adoptive home once he was physically healthy. That had been the sensible approach. Sarah's work schedule was demanding, her finances tight, and taking on permanent responsibility for a special needs dog hadn't been in her life plan. But in the months since she'd carried that broken creature, out of the rain, everything had changed. Phoenix had become the center of her world, his small victories her greatest joys, his setbacks her deepest concerns. The thought of surrendering him to someone else, even someone kind and capable, felt like contemplating the amputation of a limb. "I think you made your decision a long time ago," Dr. Harmon observed, when Sarah raised the question during one of Phoenix's checkups. The dog was now reaching a healthy weight, his coat gleaming, the last of his visible wounds healed into scars that would always tell his story, but no longer defined him. "I know," Sarah admitted. "I just wanted to make sure I was being fair to him, my schedule, my small place. He deserves the best possible life after everything he's been through." Dr. Harmon looked pointedly at Phoenix, who was leaning against Sarah's leg, his body relaxed, his eyes following her movements with clear attachment. "Does he look unhappy to you?" She had to concede that he didn't. Despite the lingering effects of his trauma, His fear of certain noises, his wariness around unfamiliar men, his occasional retreats into that distant, unreachable state. Phoenix had found contentment in the life they'd built together. When Sarah signed the lease renewal for another 6 months, Lisa wasn't surprised. "That dog was meant for you," she said simply, "and you for him." Sarah couldn't argue with that assessment. What had begun as an impulsive rescue on a rainy night had evolved into the most rewarding relationship of her life. Every small step in Phoenix's recovery felt like a shared victory, every moment of connection a gift she hadn't known she needed. What she couldn't anticipate was how Phoenix's presence in her life would open other doors. It started with Ryan's reading sessions, which had expanded to include several of his friends from school. The children would visit in small groups, taking turns reading, while Phoenix listened attentively, now comfortable enough to accept gentle petting from these familiar young humans. One afternoon, Ryan's teacher, Ms. Abernathy, came along to observe. She was so impressed by Phoenix's gentle interaction with the children that she approached Sarah with a proposition. "We have a program at the school for children with reading difficulties," she explained. "Some of them struggle with embarrassment reading aloud in class, but they often feel more comfortable reading to animals. Would you consider bringing Phoenix in once a week? We have all the necessary permits and insurance." Sarah was hesitant. While Phoenix had made enormous progress, he was still sensitive to new environments and large groups. The idea of bringing him into a school seemed risky. "We could start small," Ms. Abernathy suggested, seeing Sarah's concern. "Just 1 or 2 children in a quiet room. If it goes well, we could gradually expand." After careful consideration and consultation with Dr. Harmon, Sarah agreed to a trial visit. They prepared Phoenix as thoroughly as possible, introducing him to the scents of the school through items Ryan brought home, practicing with recordings of classroom sounds and working on his stay commands in various environments. The first session was scheduled for a Saturday when the school would be largely empty. Phoenix would meet just one student, a 9-year-old boy named Marcus, who had significant reading anxiety related to a stutter. Sarah arrived early, giving Phoenix ample time to explore the small classroom that had been set aside for the program. He was nervous but managing, staying close to Sarah's side as he investigated the unfamiliar space. When Marcus arrived with his mother, Phoenix retreated to the corner where Sarah had set up his bed. The boy looked equally apprehensive, clinging to his mother's hand. "Marcus, this is Miss Bennett and Phoenix," Miss Abernathy introduced them gently. "Phoenix is a very good listener who never minds if you need to take your time with words." Marcus nodded, eyeing the dog with a mixture of fear and fascination. Sarah noticed that Phoenix, rather than showing his typical wariness of strangers, was watching the boy with what appeared to be recognition, not of Marcus specifically, but perhaps of the anxiety the child was projecting. "Would you like to sit down and get to know Phoenix a bit before you read?" Sarah suggested, gesturing to a beanbag chair they'd placed near Phoenix's bed. Marcus hesitated, then nodded again. He approached cautiously, lowering himself into the beanbag without taking his eyes off Phoenix. The dog remained still, watching the boy with the same gentle attention he gave to Ryan during their reading sessions. "You can talk to him if you want," Sarah encouraged. "Phoenix likes to hear people's voices." Marcus swallowed hard. "Hello, Phoenix," he managed, his stutter pronounced. Phoenix's response was remarkable. He slowly lifted his head, ears, perked forward in interest, and then, In a gesture that brought tears to Sarah's eyes, he inched his bed closer to Marcus's beanbag, deliberately decreasing the distance between them. It was such a small movement, but its meaning was profound. Phoenix, who had once been so broken that he could barely acknowledge human presence, was now reaching out to offer comfort to a child who was struggling. Marcus seemed to understand the significance. His tense shoulders relaxed slightly, and he reached out a tentative hand, which Phoenix gently sniffed before allowing the boy to stroke his ear. "He likes me," Marcus said with wonder. "He does," Sarah confirmed. "He can tell you're kind." The reading session that followed was nothing short of magical. Marcus stuttered less when addressing his words to Phoenix rather than the adults. In the room, the dog maintained his attentive posture, somehow seeming to understand that his calm presence was exactly what the boy needed. By the end of the 30-minute session, both Marcus and Phoenix appeared more relaxed and confident. When it was time to leave, Marcus asked, "Will Paige Phoenix come back next week?" Sarah looked at the dog, who was now comfortably stretched out beside the beanbag chair, then at Miss Abernathy, who was beaming with satisfaction. "Yes," Sarah decided. "I think he'd like that very much." What began with that single session quickly evolved into a structured program. Phoenix started visiting the school twice a week, working with children who struggled not just with reading, but with various emotional and social challenges. His calm, non-judgmental presence seemed to have a uniquely soothing effect on children who, like him, carried invisible wounds. The local newspaper ran a story about the program, featuring a photograph of Phoenix surrounded by smiling children. The headline read, "Rescue Dog Becomes Healing Force for Local Students." The article detailed Phoenix's journey from near-death to his new role as what the journalist dubbed a canine counselor. It included quotes from parents who noticed improvements in their children's reading skills and emotional well-being after sessions with Phoenix, as well as a statement from Dr. Harmon about the therapeutic benefits of human-animal bonding. Most moving to Sarah was the quote from Marcus, who had progressed to reading whole paragraphs with minimal stuttering. "Phoenix doesn't care if I mess up. He just listens, and that makes me be brave." The publicity led to an unexpected opportunity. A representative from the regional children's hospital contacted Sarah about bringing Phoenix in to visit young patients in their long-term care ward. The hospital already had a therapy dog program, but they were particularly interested in Phoenix's story of recovery as an inspiration for children facing their own difficult healing journeys. This would require official therapy dog certification, a process that involved formal training, evaluation, and registration. It would be challenging and time-consuming, but as Sarah watched Phoenix grow more confident and purposeful with each school visit, she couldn't deny that he seemed to have found his calling in helping others. "What do you think, boy?" she asked him the evening after receiving the hospital's proposal. "Ready for a new adventure?" Phoenix, now comfortable enough to claim a spot on the sofa beside her, rested his head on her lap and looked up with eyes that held none of the emptiness she'd first seen in them. Instead, they shone with something that, against all odds, looked remarkably like purpose. The therapy dog certification process proved more challenging than Sarah had anticipated. Phoenix needed to master basic obedience commands, remain calm in chaotic environments, and demonstrate comfort with being handled by strangers, all significant hurdles for a dog with his history of trauma. The certification organization had warned Sarah that given Phoenix's background, success was far from guaranteed. Many dogs with abuse histories never qualify. The evaluator, a no-nonsense woman named Diane, had explained during their preliminary assessment. It's not a reflection on your training or their value as companions. It's simply that therapy work requires a very specific temperament and emotional resilience. Dogs with PTSD, which Phoenix clearly has, often find the unpredictability of therapy environments too stressful. But Sarah had seen something in Phoenix that the evaluator hadn't, a growing desire to connect, particularly with those who were vulnerable. She'd witnessed how differently he behaved around Marcus and the other children, how his own anxiety seemed to dissipate when focused on someone else's needs. "We'd like to try anyway," Sarah had insisted. "Even if we don't succeed, the training itself will be good for him." Their training sessions began on a warm Saturday morning in a park across town, far from Phoenix's familiar territory. Diane had recommended starting in neutral locations to avoid territory-based confidence that might mask underlying issues. The first session was rough. Phoenix clung to Sarah's side, startling at every jogger, bicycle, and barking dog. When a child ran past, screaming with delight, Phoenix froze completely, his body rigid with fear. "This is going to take time," Diane observed, not unkindly. "He's hyper-vigilant, classic sign of abuse. Let's work on creating positive associations with these triggers." For the next hour, they practiced simple exercises. Sit, stay, watch me, while gradually decreasing their distance from the playground. Each time Phoenix managed to maintain his composure as children played nearby, he received treats and quiet, praise. By the end of the session, he was able to sit calmly 20 feet from the playground, though his eyes still tracked every movement with wary attention. "Not bad for a first day," Diane conceded. "He's smart and he wants to please you. That's a good foundation." The training continued 3 times a week. Sarah rearranged her work schedule, trading shifts and taking on weekend emergency rotations, in exchange for weekday mornings off. Each session built upon the previous one, gradually exposing Phoenix to more challenging environments, bustling farmers' markets, outdoor concerts, crowded pet stores. Progress was measured in tiny increments. The day Phoenix allowed a stranger to pet him without first retreating behind Sarah's legs. The afternoon he managed to hold a stay position while children played ball 10 feet away. The morning he voluntarily approached an elderly man in a wheelchair, something that would have been unthinkable months earlier. Through it all, Sarah marveled at Phoenix's determination. Despite his fear, despite the triggers that sometimes sent him into momentary shutdowns, he kept trying. It was as if he understood that this work, this stretching beyond his comfort zone, had purpose beyond mere obedience. 4 months into their training, they faced their biggest challenge yet, a controlled hospital environment simulation. The training center had set up a room to mimic a hospital setting, complete with beeping equipment, rolling beds, and volunteers playing the roles of patients and medical staff. "This is where we separate the potential therapy dogs from the pets," Diane explained as she led Sarah and Phoenix to the simulation room. "We need to see how he handles the sounds, the smells, the unpredictable movements. A dog that gets spooked by a rolling gurney or a dropped instrument can't work in a medical setting." Sarah's stomach knotted with anxiety as they approached the door. Phoenix, sensing her tension, pressed against her leg, his own body stiffening in response. "Relax," Diane advised. "Dogs read our emotions. If you're nervous, He'll assume there's something to be afraid of. Sarah took a deep breath, consciously relaxing her shoulders and hand that held the leash. "We've got this," she whispered to Phoenix, not entirely convinced herself. The simulation began simply enough. They entered a waiting room area where volunteers sat leafing through magazines or typing on phones. Phoenix handled this well, maintaining his heel position beside Sarah as they navigated between chairs. A volunteer in scrubs approached, asked permission to pet Phoenix, and gave him a gentle stroke on the head when Sarah agreed. Phoenix tolerated the touch without flinching, a major improvement from months earlier. Then came the challenges. A metal tray clattered to the floor without warning. Phoenix startled, but recovered quickly, looking to Sarah for reassurance. A volunteer in a wheelchair rolled suddenly around a corner, coming within inches of them. Phoenix backed up a step, but didn't bolt or growl. A mock patient coughed violently as they passed. Phoenix's ears flattened, but he kept walking. By the time they reached the final station, a hospital bed where a volunteer lay attached to a softly beeping heart monitor, Sarah was cautiously optimistic. Phoenix had been startled several times, but had maintained his composure, looking to her for guidance rather than succumbing to panic. "Now we'll see if he can approach the bed," Diane instructed. "The volunteer patient will reach out for him. Phoenix needs to allow the touch without backing away or showing stress signals." Sarah guided Phoenix toward the bed, keeping the leash loose to avoid communicating tension. The patient, an older woman with a kind smile, slowly extended her hand. "Hello, beautiful," she said softly to Phoenix. "Would you come say hello?" Phoenix hesitated, looking up at Sarah. She nodded encouragingly. "It's okay. Go say hi." To Sarah's amazement, Phoenix took a step forward, then another, until he was close enough for the woman to gently stroke his head. He didn't lean into the touch as a fully comfortable dog might, but he accepted it calmly, his tail hanging in a neutral position rather than tucked under in fear. "Good boy," the woman murmured. "Such a gentle soul." Something in her tone must have reached Phoenix, because he did something Sarah had never seen him do with a stranger before. He lowered his head and placed it lightly on the edge of the bed, just touching the woman's blanket-covered leg. Intrigued, Sarah followed. Phoenix led her to a small clearing where, to her astonishment, a thin, bedraggled cat huddled beneath a fallen log. The cat's matted fur and wary eyes immediately told Sarah this was no one's pet. This was a stray, possibly feral, definitely in need of help. Phoenix approached the cat with exquisite gentleness, lowering his body to appear less threatening, his tail wagging slightly in a non-aggressive signal. The cat hissed weakly but didn't run, perhaps too exhausted or ill to flee. "Phoenix, careful," Sarah warned, concerned about how the cat might react. But Phoenix seemed to know exactly what he was doing. He lay down a few feet from the log, his head on his paws, the picture of non-threatening patience. Sarah watched in amazement as, over the next 15 minutes, Phoenix simply waited. Occasionally he would inch slightly closer, then freeze again, giving the cat time to adjust to his presence. Eventually, incredibly, the cat emerged a few inches from its hiding place, nose twitching as it assessed the large dog. Phoenix remained perfectly still, allowing the cat to approach at its own pace. When the cat was within a foot of him, Phoenix slowly, deliberately turned his head toward Sarah, then back to the cat, as if to say, "It's okay, she helps, she saved me too." Sarah knelt down, hardly daring to breathe. "Well, hello there," she said softly to the cat. "Looks like Phoenix thinks you could use a friend." The cat regarded her warily, then looked back at Phoenix, who maintained his calm, encouraging posture. Something in that canine reassurance seemed to register, because the cat took another tentative step forward. In that moment, as Sarah watched the formerly abused and abandoned dog, now gently coaxing another suffering creature toward trust and help, she understood with perfect clarity what Phoenix had become. Not just a survivor, not just a therapy dog, but a bridge, a living testament to the possibility of healing so complete that it overflows to others. "You found another one who needs saving," Sarah whispered to Phoenix, her heart full, "just like you did." Phoenix looked up at her, his amber eyes now clear and bright with purpose, so different from the dull resignation she had first seen. In them, Sarah saw reflected not just the traumatized animal she had rescued 6 months ago, but the extraordinary being he had become. A creature who had transformed his suffering into compassion, his scars into badges of courage, his second chance into a mission to help others find their own path to healing. "Well then," Sarah said, settling more comfortably on the ground as Phoenix resumed his gentle coaxing of the stray cat. "I guess our family might be growing. That's okay. We've got plenty of love to go around, don't we?" Phoenix's tail thumped against the forest floor in quiet agreement, his focus never leaving the scared creature before him. He had found his purpose in this new life, to be for others what Sarah had been for him, a beacon of patience, a testament to second chances, and living proof that even from the deepest wounds, extraordinary healing could emerge. As summer turned to fall, Phoenix's reputation at the children's hospital grew. What had begun as occasional visits with carefully selected patients expanded into a structured program that hospital staff now referred to as Phoenix Therapy. 3 days a week, Sarah would bring Phoenix to the pediatric wards, where he would spend hours with children battling everything from cancer to rare genetic disorders. The hospital had assigned them a dedicated volunteer coordinator, Angela, who managed their schedule and documented the effects of Phoenix's visits on patient outcomes. The results were so promising that the hospital's research department had begun a formal study, complete with consent forms and data collection protocols. "The preliminary findings are remarkable," Angela told Sarah one crisp October afternoon as they reviewed the week's schedule. "Children who receive regular visits from Phoenix show measurable decreases in anxiety markers, better sleep patterns, and in some cases, reduced need for pain medication." Sarah glanced at Phoenix, who was resting quietly at her feet beneath the cafeteria table. "I always knew he was special, but this goes beyond what I imagined." "It's not just what he does," Angela said thoughtfully. "It's who he is. These kids connect with his story, the abuse, the abandonment, the healing journey. When they see his scars, they feel less alone with their own." This was something Sarah had noticed repeatedly. Children who were self-conscious about surgical scars or hair loss from chemotherapy seemed to find comfort in Phoenix's visible imperfections. They would trace the ridged tissue around his neck with gentle fingers, asking questions about his past that opened doorways to discussions about their own fears and pain. As if sensing her reflective mood, Phoenix rose from his bed and approached the sofa, placing his head on her lap in a gesture that had become his way of offering comfort. Sarah stroked his soft ears, feeling the familiar wave of gratitude that swept over her whenever she considered how close she had come to walking past that abandoned building on that rainy night. "You know," she told him softly, "everyone thinks I rescued you, but sometimes I wonder if it wasn't the other way around." Phoenix looked up at her with those soulful amber eyes, now bright with intelligence and connection, where once they had been dull with resignation. In his gaze, Sarah saw not just the dog he had become, but a reflection of her own transformation, the expanded heart, the deeper purpose, the richer life that had come from taking a chance on a broken creature that others had discarded. Outside, snow had begun to fall, large flakes drifting past the cottage windows and settling on the yard where Phoenix now played and explored with confidence. The winter night was dark, but inside was light and warmth and the profound companionship of two beings who had healed each other. Phoenix sighed contentedly and settled more heavily against Sarah's legs. Together, they watched the snow accumulate, creating a clean white blanket over the world, a reminder that even after the harshest seasons, renewal was always possible, that second chances could lead to purposes greater than either of them could have imagined, and that sometimes the deepest wounds could become the most powerful sources of healing. 6 months after Sarah had carried a dying dog out of the rain, Phoenix had become not just a beloved companion or even a successful therapy dog, but a living testament to resilience, a daily reminder that suffering, when transformed through love and purpose, could become a bridge to others in pain, a unique qualification for the sacred work of healing. As darkness settled fully outside, Sarah whispered the truth that had gradually revealed itself through their journey together. The very things that could have destroyed you have become your greatest gifts to others. Your scars are your credentials. Your pain is your wisdom, and your healing has touched more lives than you'll ever know. Phoenix looked up at her words, his expression peaceful, content, as if to say he understood perfectly the beautiful paradox they had discovered together. That sometimes it's the most broken among us who become the most effective healers. That compassion born of suffering has a unique power to reach those in darkest places, and that the journey from victim to healer is perhaps the most profound transformation possible. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the old year and preparing the ground for the new, a fitting metaphor for the remarkable journey they had taken together and the promising future that stretched before them, filled with purpose, connection, and the special joy that comes from finding one's true calling. 6 months ago, Sarah had rescued a dying dog. Today, that dog had become a healer, touching lives in ways neither of them could have imagined on that rainy night. And in the process, Phoenix had helped Sarah discover her own deeper purpose, to serve as a bridge between the wounded and the healing power of unconditional love, a lesson she had learned from the once broken creature who now rested his head trustingly in her lap. Together, they had discovered the profound truth that sometimes the deepest wounds can become the greatest gifts, not just for ourselves, but for a world in desperate need of healing. The 6-month anniversary of Phoenix's rescue arrived on a perfect spring morning. Sarah woke early, the golden light of dawn filtering through the cottage windows. Phoenix was already up, standing by the door, his tail wagging with anticipation for their morning walk. His body, once skeletal and weak, now radiated health and vitality. The scars remained, they always would, but they were badges of survival now, not wounds that defined him. "Happy anniversary, Phoenix," Sarah said, reaching to scratch behind his ears. 6 months since that rainy night. Phoenix pressed his head into her hand, his amber eyes bright with intelligence and affection. In those eyes, Sarah no longer saw traces of the broken creature she had carried from the abandoned lot. She saw a partner, a healer, a being who had transcended suffering to become something extraordinary. Their morning walk took them along a path that wound through the woods behind Lisa's property. The forest was alive with spring, birds calling, new leaves unfurling, wildflowers dotting the undergrowth. Phoenix moved with confident grace, occasionally pausing to investigate an interesting scent or listen to a distant sound, but always returning to Sarah's side with joyful devotion. As they walked, Sarah mentally prepared for the day ahead. It would be a special one. The hospital's new animal-assisted therapy center was officially opening, a dedicated space designed specifically for Phoenix and the other therapy animals that had joined the program. After months of fundraising, planning, and construction, the vision was becoming reality. The center included a main room designed to resemble a comfortable living room rather than a clinical space, with soft furniture, natural lighting, and special areas for different types of animal interactions. There were private meeting rooms for individual sessions, storage for animal supplies, a small kitchenette, and even a special bathing station for the therapy dogs. Most importantly, there was a quiet retreat room where the animals could rest. Between sessions, away from the hospital's noise and activity, the grand opening ceremony was scheduled for noon, with hospital administrators, major donors, local media, and, most importantly, some of the children who had benefited from Phoenix's special brand of healing. Sarah felt a flutter of nerves at the thought of the speeches and attention, but Phoenix's calm presence beside her was reassuring. He had become so much more than a therapy dog. He was her anchor, her reminder of what mattered most. When they returned to the cottage, Sarah found a package waiting on the porch, a gift from Dr. Harmon, with a note attached. "For the dog who changed everything. Proud of you both." Inside was a custom-made therapy vest for Phoenix, more elegant than the standard-issue one he currently wore during hospital visits. This one was crafted of soft, high-quality material in the hospital's colors, with Phoenix Therapy Program embroidered on one side and Healing Hearts, one paw at a time, on the other. Attached to the vest was a special tag that read, "Phoenix, from rescue to rescuer." "Look at this, Phoenix," Sarah said, holding up the vest for him to see. "Special new work clothes for your big day." Phoenix sniffed the vest with interest, his tail wagging in apparent approval. When Sarah put it on him, he stood taller, as if understanding the significance of the garment. It had been a long journey from the terrified, dying dog who could barely stand to this proud therapy animal, ready to help others with his unique gifts. They arrived at the hospital an hour before the ceremony. The new center, located in what had once been an underutilized administrative wing, was transformed. The walls were painted in soothing colors, with murals of nature scenes and animals, created by local artists. Comfortable furniture arranged in conversational groupings replaced the institutional feel of typical hospital spaces. Large windows flooded the main room with natural light, while special lighting fixtures mimicked daylight in the interior spaces. "It's perfect," Sarah breathed, taking it all in. Phoenix moved beside her, exploring the new environment with interest but no anxiety. He seemed to recognize it as a space created with him in mind, a place where his work could flourish. Dr. Mehta greeted them in the main room, her typically serious demeanor softened by genuine excitement. "What do you think?" she asked, gesturing to the space around them. "Everything you hoped for?" "It's better than I imagined," Sarah replied honestly. "I can't believe we've come this far in just 6 months." Dr. Mehta smiled, reaching down to greet Phoenix with a gentle pat. "When you brought this proposal to me, I thought it was ambitious. A dedicated therapy space? A full program built around animal-assisted healing. But the results we've seen, especially with Phoenix, they speak for themselves." The results she referred to had been formally documented now. The research study initiated months earlier had yielded impressive preliminary data. Children who participated in regular sessions with Phoenix showed measurable decreases in stress hormones, reduced anxiety, improved sleep patterns, and in some cases, accelerated physical healing. More subjectively, but perhaps more importantly, they showed increased willingness to engage with medical procedures, greater emotional openness with psychologists and social workers, and improved overall quality of life during their hospital stays. "The board is discussing expanding the program to other departments," Dr. Mehta continued. "Adult oncology has expressed particular interest, and we've had inquiries from 3 other hospitals about implementing similar programs." Sarah nodded, pride swelling in her chest. What had begun as one woman's impulsive rescue of a dying dog had evolved into something that could potentially transform approaches to healing across multiple institutions. It was humbling and exhilarating at once. "None of this would have happened without Phoenix," she said, watching as he explored the center's main room with confident curiosity. "He's the heart of it all. And you," Dr. Mehta added firmly. "Don't discount your role in this, Sarah. Your vision, your advocacy, your understanding of the human-animal bond, they've been essential. Phoenix might be the face of the program, but you're its architect." Before Sarah could respond, the first guests began to arrive. Hospital administrators in formal attire, donors whose contributions had made the center possible, local government officials who had supported the initiative. Phoenix greeted each visitor with his characteristic gentle attentiveness, accepting their admiration with dignified grace. Then came the guests who mattered most, the children and families whose lives Phoenix had touched. Zoe, now fully recovered from her heart surgery, rushed to Phoenix with unbridled enthusiasm, dropping to her knees to embrace him. Marcus, whose stutter had improved dramatically through his reading sessions with Phoenix, proudly showed off his ability to read aloud from a speech he had prepared for the occasion. Elijah, still healing physically and emotionally, but making remarkable progress in his foster home, approached more quietly, but with deep affection, whispering something private in Phoenix's ear that made the dog press closer to him in apparent understanding. Other children came too, some in wheelchairs, some trailing IV poles, some wearing the telltale caps that covered heads made bare by chemotherapy. Each had their own story, their own special connection with the dog who had come into their lives at a time of fear and pain and had somehow made that burden lighter. As the official ceremony began, Sarah found herself at the podium, Phoenix sitting calmly at her side. Looking out at the gathered crowd, medical professionals, administrators, donors, and the children and families who represented Phoenix's true impact, she felt momentarily overwhelmed. 6 months ago, she began, her voice steadying as she spoke. "I found a dog dying in an abandoned industrial lot. He had been abused, neglected, and finally discarded like garbage when he became too sick to be useful. He was tied to a post and left to die alone." The room was completely silent, every eye fixed on Phoenix, who sat with quiet dignity beside her. By every logical assessment, that should have been the end of his story. But something in him, some spark of resilience, some will to live despite everything, caught my attention that night. I couldn't walk away. What I didn't realize then was that in saving him, I was setting in motion something far greater than one dog's rescue. Sarah paused, gathering her thoughts. Phoenix's journey from victim to healer has been nothing short of miraculous. Not because he magically recovered. Without setbacks or struggles, he didn't. There were days of pain, nights of fear, moments when I wondered if he would ever trust again. But slowly, step by step, he not only healed physically but emotionally, and then something extraordinary happened. She glanced down at Phoenix, who looked up at her with complete trust and partnership. Phoenix began to use his own experience of suffering to connect with others in pain, first with children in school reading programs, then with patients here at the hospital. He developed an uncanny ability to sense who needed him most and how they needed him, whether that was playful distraction, silent presence, or the special comfort that comes from recognizing a fellow survivor. Around the room, Sarah saw nods of recognition, especially from the families whose children had experienced Phoenix's unique form of healing. The program we're officially launching today isn't just about the documented medical benefits of animal-assisted therapy, though those are significant and growing. It's about something more fundamental, the healing power of connection. Phoenix teaches us that our deepest wounds can become our greatest gifts to others, that suffering transformed through love and purpose can become a unique qualification for the sacred work of healing. Sarah saw tears in the eyes of many listeners now, but they were tears of recognition and hope, not sadness. This center represents our commitment to that philosophy. It will be a space where the special bond between humans and animals can flourish, where children facing the most challenging circumstances can find comfort and courage, where healing extends beyond the physical to encompass heart and spirit. She looked around the room, at the doctors who had initially been skeptical but now championed the program, at the donors whose generosity had made the center possible, at the children whose lives had been touched by a dog once considered disposable. 6 months ago, Phoenix was dying, abandoned, his potential nearly extinguished by cruelty. Today, he stands before you as a certified therapy dog, the cornerstone of a program that's already changing lives and may soon extend to other hospitals. His story reminds us that no one, human or animal, is beyond redemption, that purpose can emerge from pain, and that sometimes the most wounded among us become the most powerful healers. Sarah concluded her speech to resounding applause. Phoenix, sensing the significance of the moment, stood tall beside her, his posture reflecting a dignity and purpose that moved many in the audience to tears. The ceremonial ribbon cutting followed, with Zoe and Elijah holding the scissors together while Phoenix helped by tugging on a special ribbon attached to the lower portion. Cameras flashed, applause filled the room, and the Phoenix Therapy Center was officially open. As the formal ceremony transitioned to a reception, Sarah found herself surrounded by well-wishers and congratulations. Parents shared stories of how Phoenix had helped their children through the darkest days of illness or trauma. Medical staff recounted cases where his presence had made breakthrough treatments possible. Even hospital administrators, typically focused on metrics and outcomes, spoke with genuine emotion about the transformation they had witnessed in young patients after Phoenix's visits. In the midst of the celebration, Sarah noticed Phoenix slipping away from the crowd. Following him, she found him in one of the center's private meeting rooms, sitting beside a young girl who had retreated from the noise and excitement. The child, no more than 7 or 8, was curled in a corner chair, her thin face pale and drawn, an oxygen tube running from a portable tank to her nostrils. Phoenix had settled beside her chair, his head resting gently on her lap. The girl's hand moved slowly through his fur, finding comfort in the repetitive motion. Neither had noticed Sarah in the doorway. "Were you scared?" the girl asked Phoenix in a whisper. "When you were sick like me?" Phoenix lifted his head slightly, looking into her eyes with that special attentiveness that had become his hallmark. "Sarah says you almost died," the girl continued, "but you got better. You got strong again." Phoenix nudged his nose against her hand, his eyes never leaving her face. "I want to get better too," the child confided, "but sometimes I get really tired of fighting. Sometimes I want to give up." Phoenix shifted position, moving closer, resting more of his weight against her chair. The girl bent forward, wrapping her thin arms around his neck in a gentle embrace. "If you could do it, maybe I can too," she whispered into his fur. Sarah backed away quietly, not wanting to intrude on the sacred moment unfolding between the sick child and the dog who understood suffering in a way few could. This, she realized, was Phoenix's true gift, not just providing comfort, but offering living proof that survival was possible, that pain could be endured, that healing could come even from the darkest places. Later, as the reception wound down and guests began to depart, Dr. Mehta approached Sarah with a surprising announcement. "The hospital foundation has received an anonymous donation," she said, her voice betraying unusual emotion. "A substantial one specifically designated for the Phoenix Therapy Program." "How substantial?" Sarah asked, surprised. $2 million, Dr. Mehta replied. Sarah's jaw dropped. $2 million? That's incredible. What does the donor want in return? Naming rights? Special recognition? That's the remarkable part, Dr. Mehta said. They've requested complete anonymity. No recognition, no naming rights, nothing. The only stipulation is that the money be used to expand the program, training more therapy dogs, supporting families who can't afford animal-assisted therapy, researching outcomes, and potentially bringing the model to other facilities. Sarah was stunned. Did they say why? Why such generosity with no recognition? Dr. Mehta smiled. The donor left only a brief note with the gift. It said, "Because a dog who was given no value by some has shown us all the immeasurable value of compassion, may his story transform many more lives." The magnitude of the gift and the sentiment behind it left Sarah speechless. What had begun with one small act of mercy on a rainy night had rippled outward in ways she could never have imagined, touching lives, inspiring generosity, creating possibilities for healing that extended far beyond one dog and one hospital. As the day drew to a close and Sarah prepared to take Phoenix home, a familiar face appeared at the center's entrance. Dr. Harmon, dressed not in his usual clinic attire, but in a suit and tie, looking somewhat uncomfortable in the formal wear. "I couldn't miss this," he said gruffly, bending to greet Phoenix with uncharacteristic openness. "Had to see for myself what my former assistant has accomplished." Sarah smiled, touched by his presence. "I couldn't have done any of it without your support. You gave Phoenix a chance when many vets would have recommended euthanasia." Dr. Harmon shrugged, though his eyes revealed more emotion than he would typically allow. "I just provided medical care. You're the one who saw his potential, who believed he could be more than a victim of his circumstances." They walked together through the center, Dr. Harmon taking in the thoughtfully designed spaces, the photographs of Phoenix with various patients displayed on the walls, the evidence of how far they had come. "You know," he said finally, "in 30 years of veterinary practice, I've treated thousands of animals, saved many lives, but I've never seen anything quite like this. One dog's journey affecting so many human lives. It's humbling." Sarah nodded, understanding perfectly. "Phoenix showed me that healing isn't just physical. It's not even just emotional. It's about finding meaning in suffering, purpose in pain. He could have emerged from his trauma fearful or aggressive. Instead, he became a healer in his own right." Dr. Harmon watched as Phoenix greeted a young patient who had wandered into the center, the dog adjusting his approach instinctively to accommodate the child's hesitant demeanor. "The most remarkable rehabilitation I've ever witnessed," he observed. Quietly, not just from dying to living, but from victim to healer. After Dr. Harmon left, Sarah and Phoenix made one final tour of the center before heading home. The spacious rooms, now empty of visitors, held the promise of countless healing moments to come. Children would find comfort here. Families would find hope. Medical procedures would be made less traumatic, pain would be eased, and at the heart of it all would be Phoenix, the dog who had transformed his own suffering into a unique capacity for healing others. His story, displayed on a plaque near the entrance, would inspire all who entered, from the brink of death to bringing life and hope to others. Phoenix reminds us that our deepest wounds can become our greatest gifts. As they stepped outside, into the spring evening, Sarah noticed a man standing near the center's entrance watching them. Something about his posture, his furtive glance, triggered a vague sense of unease. Phoenix tensed slightly beside her, his body language shifting in a way Sarah had learned to read over their months together. "Can I help you?" she asked, keeping her voice friendly despite her caution. The man hesitated, then stepped forward, into the light. He was middle-aged, heavily built, with weather-roughened features and calloused hands that spoke of manual labor. His eyes, when they finally met hers, held a storm of conflicting emotions. "That's him, isn't it?" he asked, nodding toward Phoenix. "The dog from the news stories, the one they found tied up and left to die." Sarah instinctively moved closer to Phoenix, her hand dropping to rest on his back. "Yes, this is Phoenix." The man swallowed hard, his gaze now fixed on Phoenix. "I've been following the stories about him, what he's doing for those kids, how he's helping them." Something in his voice, a tremor of emotion carefully controlled, made Sarah study him more carefully. Phoenix, surprisingly, had not retreated behind her legs as he typically did with unfamiliar men. Instead, he stood calmly, watching the stranger with attentive eyes. "He's an extraordinary dog," Sarah acknowledged, still uncertain of the man's purpose. "I know what happened to him," the man said suddenly, his voice rough. "The collar that grew into his neck, the starvation, being tied up and left. A chill ran down Sarah's spine. This wasn't information that had been shared in all the media coverage. Some details of Phoenix's abuse had been kept private, considered too disturbing for general audiences. "How do you know that?" she asked, her voice steady despite the adrenaline now coursing through her body. The man looked away, his jaw working with emotion. "Because I'm the one who did it." Sarah gasped, her fingers tightening in Phoenix's fur. A surge of anger, hot and immediate, flooded through her. This was the person responsible for Phoenix's suffering, the one who had subjected him to years of neglect and then left him to die alone. "You," she began, unable to find words adequate for the magnitude of her feelings. "I don't expect forgiveness," the man said quickly, raising his hands in a gesture that was part defense, part surrender. "I don't deserve it. I needed to see him, to know it was real." "What was real?" Sarah asked, struggling to maintain her composure. "That he survived, that he became something good." The man's voice broke on the last word. "I've been watching the news stories about him, reading the articles about how he helps sick kids who've been hurt, like I hurt him." Phoenix, to Sarah's absolute astonishment, took a step toward the man, his body language cautious but not fearful. Years of working with abused animals had taught Sarah to recognize when they encountered former abusers. They typically showed clear stress signals, trembling, tucked tails, ears flat against their heads. But Phoenix displayed none of these. He seemed curious, watchful, but not afraid. "Why?" Sarah managed to ask. "Why did you hurt him? Why did you leave him to die?" The man's shoulders slumped. "I was different then. Drinking too much. Angry. All the time. Had him since he was a pup, but I never treated him right. Put that collar on him when he was young and just left it. When he got sick, I couldn't afford a vet, couldn't stand to watch him suffering, so I—" His voice trailed off, unable to complete the terrible admission. Sarah felt physically ill, imagining Phoenix in this man's care. Years of neglect, the collar growing tighter as he matured, the slow starvation, and finally the cruel abandonment. "I saw him on the local news a few months back," the man continued. "Couldn't believe. It was the same dog. They showed before and after pictures. Talked about what he was doing at the hospital. It hit me hard, what I'd done to him, and what he became despite me." Phoenix had moved slightly closer to the man, still maintaining a careful distance, but showing none of the fear Sarah would have expected. It was as if he recognized his former owner, but was approaching the situation from a place of strength rather than trauma. "I got sober after that," the man said, his voice steadier now. "Seeing what he'd become, it made me realize I needed to change too. Been clean for 4 months now, got a steady job, started making amends where I can." Sarah struggled to process this unexpected turn of events. The man responsible for Phoenix's suffering was standing before them, not making excuses, not asking for forgiveness, but somehow transformed by the very animal he had wronged. "I don't expect you to believe me," he continued when Sarah remained silent, "and I'm not asking to be part of his life. I needed to see him, to know it was real, that something good could come from someone like me." Phoenix, who had advanced a few more steps, now stood equidistant between Sarah and the man. His posture was alert but not tense, his gaze moving between the two humans as if understanding the complexities of the moment in ways beyond language. "He was always smart," the man said softly, looking at Phoenix with something like wonder. "Even when I was hurting him, there was something in his eyes, like he understood more than a dog should." Sarah found her voice at last. "Phoenix has an extraordinary capacity for empathy. He connects with people who are suffering because he knows what suffering is. That's not because of what you did to him. It's despite it. It's because of his inherent nature and the care he received after you abandoned him." The man nodded, accepting her words without defense. "I know. I'm not trying to take credit. I needed to see that good things can happen even after someone like me has done their worst, that there's hope for change." In that moment, Sarah realized that Phoenix's journey had touched yet another life in an unexpected way. This man, his former abuser, had been moved to seek recovery, to begin making amends because of what Phoenix had become after escaping his cruelty. "What are you going to do now?" she asked, her anger not gone, but tempered by the complexity of the situation. "Keep working my program, stay sober, try to be better than I was." He gestured toward the hospital. "Maybe someday make a donation to what he's doing here. Anonymous, of course. I don't want recognition. I just want to add something positive to balance out the harm I've done." Sarah considered his words, searching for insincerity or manipulation and finding none. The man before her seemed genuinely changed, humbled by the transformation of the dog he had discarded. Phoenix, making his own decision, took another step toward his former owner, then stopped, sitting down on the path between them. It wasn't an approach of affection or reconciliation. He maintained a clear boundary, but neither was it fear or aggression. It was, Sarah realized, a position of quiet strength. Phoenix was facing his past without being diminished by it. You should go," the man said, seeming to understand that the encounter had reached its natural conclusion. "Thank you for letting me see him, for what you've done for him, for what he's doing for those kids." As he turned to leave, Sarah called after him, "What's your name?" He paused. "Michael." "Michael," she repeated. "Phoenix is thriving. Now he has purpose, connection, joy. Whatever you did to him, that's his reality now." Michael nodded, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. That's good to know." As he walked away, disappearing into the gathering dusk, Sarah knelt beside Phoenix, checking him for signs of distress. To her amazement, he seemed completely calm, watching his former abuser leave with what could only be described as equanimity. "You never cease to amaze me," she told him softly. "Even now, even with him, you choose strength over fear." Phoenix turned to her, pressing his head against her shoulder in a gesture of connection that had become their private language of comfort and understanding. In his calm demeanor, Sarah sensed not an absence of memory, but a transcendence of it. Phoenix remembered, but the memory no longer held power over him. The encounter, unexpected and profound, added yet another dimension to Phoenix's extraordinary journey. Not only had he transformed from victim to healer, but his transformation had created ripples that reached even those who had harmed him. Without seeking revenge, without even conscious intention, he had become an agent of change in the life of his former abuser. As they walked to Sarah's car in the soft spring twilight, she reflected on the perfect symmetry of Phoenix's story. 6 months ago, he had been a dying dog, discarded by someone who saw no value in him. Today, he was at the center of a multi-million-dollar program that would touch countless lives, and even the man who had abused him had been moved to seek redemption by witnessing what Phoenix had become. At the cottage, the evening settled around them with peaceful familiarity. Phoenix took his customary place on the sofa beside Sarah, his head resting in her lap as she absently stroked his ears. The encounter with Michael had shaken her, bringing back the anger and horror she had felt when first finding Phoenix in that abandoned lot. But Phoenix himself seemed untouched by the meeting, his demeanor as calm and centered as ever. "How do you do it?" she asked him softly. "How do you face what hurt you without being diminished by it?" Phoenix looked up at her with those soulful, amber eyes, now bright with life and purpose where once they had been dull with resignation. In their depths, Sarah saw the answer to her question. Phoenix lived fully in the present. He carried his past. It was visible in his scars, evident in his occasional moments of fear, but he did not dwell there. Each day was a new opportunity to connect, to comfort, to use his unique gifts for healing. The truth of Phoenix's journey suddenly crystallized for Sarah with perfect clarity. His transformation from victim to healer wasn't about forgetting the past or pretending it hadn't happened. It was about integrating that experience into a larger, more meaningful narrative. It was about allowing suffering to deepen compassion rather than harden into bitterness. It was about choosing each day to focus on what could be given rather than what had been taken. As the night deepened around the cottage, Sarah realized that Phoenix had taught her the most profound lesson of all. True healing isn't about erasing wounds, but about transforming them into wisdom. It isn't about denying pain, but about channeling it into purpose. It isn't about forgetting trauma, but about ensuring that trauma doesn't have the final word in one's story. 6 months after carrying a dying dog out of the rain, Sarah had witnessed a transformation so complete it defied conventional understanding. Phoenix had evolved from a discarded, suffering creature into a being of purpose and profound impact. His journey from victim to healer had inspired a hospital program, touched countless lives, moved strangers to extraordinary generosity, and even prompted his former abuser to seek redemption. But perhaps most remarkably, Phoenix had shown Sarah herself a new way of understanding healing, not as a return to what was before trauma, but as an evolution into something stronger, wiser, and more compassionate because of it. In saving him, she had gained not just a beloved companion, but a teacher whose silent wisdom had transformed her own understanding of resilience and purpose. Outside, the spring night was alive with possibilities. Inside, woman and dog rested, together in the quiet understanding that had grown between them. Two beings whose paths had crossed by chance, but whose journey together had been nothing short of miraculous. Phoenix, once left to die alone in the darkness, now slept peacefully in the light of a home filled with love and purpose. His body, once broken by cruelty, now served as a vessel for healing. His spirit, once nearly extinguished by neglect, now burned bright with the special radiance that comes from transforming one's deepest wounds into gifts for others. 6 months after Sarah had made the spontaneous decision to investigate a sound in the rain, a dying dog had become a healer. A discarded animal had become the heart of a groundbreaking therapy program, and an act of simple compassion had blossomed into a mission touching countless lives. As Phoenix drifted into contented sleep beside her, Sarah whispered the truth that had revealed itself through their extraordinary journey together. Sometimes, the things meant to destroy us become the very foundations of our purpose. Sometimes, our deepest wounds become our greatest gifts to the world, and sometimes a single act of kindness can set in motion transformations beyond our wildest dreams. Outside, the stars wheeled overhead, bearing silent witness to the quiet miracle that had unfolded on earth below. The miracle of a broken being made whole, not simply for his own sake, but for the healing of others. Phoenix's journey from victim to healer was more than just one dog's story. It was a testament to the resilience of the spirit and the transformative power of purpose. 6 months had changed everything. A dog left to die had become a source of life and hope for others. A chance encounter in the rain had blossomed into a mission touching countless lives. And in the process, both woman and dog had discovered a truth as old as suffering itself, that sometimes our most painful experiences become our most powerful tools for helping others, that empathy born of suffering has a unique capacity to reach those in darkness, and that the journey from victim to healer may be the most profound transformation possible. Phoenix, once abandoned and left for dead, had become living proof that no being is beyond redemption, that purpose can emerge from pain, and that sometimes the most wounded among us become the most effective healers of all. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.